Say one thing for the First Law trilogy. Say it's the best goddamn thing I've ever read in my life. What was that? Joseph! Joseph!
We did it, Joe. You're gonna be the next president of the United States.
Okay. Today I'm going to be talking about Before They Are Hanged and the Last Argument of Kings. This is a sequel video, so to speak, to my Blade Itself review. I'm not going to be introducing what this story is, so I'd recommend you watch that first if you're not familiar. I won't be going into any spoilers except for at the end of the video, so stick around for that if you're interested. But for a brief recap, I really enjoyed The Blade itself. But I definitely saw it, you know, as the first chapter of a larger story. This was mostly just the setup book. It was introducing us to this world, establishing its characters, and setting up the future events to come. And it definitely excelled in that area. It just didn't have like a super crazy narrative, and I don't think it really needed to. I thought the sequels needed to. And, so Before They Are Hanged picks up right where the last one left off, and we continue to follow all of our point of view characters who find themselves in very different places this time around. A group of them head on a whimsical journey across the land in pursuit of a magical object, while others see themselves placed in locations that are right in the middle of the big war going on with the North, or the war going on with the South. There's a lot of wars going on. And right away, this like big change in location keeps things super fresh. I liked how the world building was presented in the first book because we were following so many different characters of so many different walks of life. But a majority of that book did take place in a single city. Whereas now we have all of these different characters in completely different environments, which serves again to build out the world more, but also sees the characters completely out of their element, which leads to some new conflicts that they must face and some excellent character development. And that is no understatement, man. I already thought that like just the establishing of the characters in The Blade itself was top tier, but now as we actually see them grow and develop in Before They Are Hanged, it is clear that Joe Abercrombie is one of the absolute masters of the genre. And the fact that this series was the first thing he had ever put out is absolutely absurd to me. These characters are just so enjoyable to follow. Some of them are good guys, some of them definitely aren't, but they all just have such fascinating stories, and their interactions together are so amazing. The dialogue here is on another level. There's one chapter in this book, it's called Scars, and it's one of the best chapters in the whole trilogy, where it just has a bunch of our main characters sitting around a fire and giving sort of their past stories, the history of how they got certain scars on their bodies. And moments like this are just so incredible because you really see these bonds form between all these different characters and sort of watch in real time as they grow and change. The characters are at a very different place by the end of this book that they were in at the start, and it was an absolutely brilliant journey. I don't want to say much about the rest of the characters just because, you know, I don't want to give away who lives and dies, but I will say that my man, Inquisitor Glokta, might be my favorite fantasy character ever. Like, holy crap, I have never rooted for someone so evil before, and it was awesome. We also have a lot more action in this book as some of the characters are on the front lines. And again, Abercrombie is just fantastic at creating visceral and like intense action scenes. He's very conservative with the use of magic in this world. Of course, there is plenty of magic and it is very terrifying, but one of the reasons why it's like that is because he knows not to go overboard with it. So when magic does show up, it has such a crazy impact. So this one completely exceeded my expectations. I would not call this a sophomore slump in the slightest, and I gave it a big ol' 5 stars. So if the first book was the setup and the second book was the journey, this right here was the climax. And this was one of the best books I've ever read in my life. I could not believe this. I could not believe this book, okay? This story had always been about character work and development. When I look at the first two books, I'm not going to say that the actual narrative is the thing that stands out the most about it. And that's why in this one, the narrative sneaks up behind you and hits you 50 times over the head with a hammer. The insane amount of shocking twists and reveals in this book does not make sense. Right from the start, we are hit with new revelations that change absolutely everything we knew about this story, veering it into insanely unexpected and wild directions. But they are directions that you realize that, yeah, the series had sort of been building up to them, whether we knew it or not. Now looking back at the previous books, I noticed all the seeds that Abercrombie had been planting, and it made me appreciate those books even more. To the point where if I had time, I would probably want to reread The Blade itself right now. And the book doesn't really let up at all. Almost every few chapters there's something absolutely insane happening. Of course, this is the finale of the trilogy, so as you would expect, there is a ton of action with very high stakes. A lot of massive moments are happening for the characters we've been following all this time, and the payoffs to everything were pretty much perfect. And one of the most fascinating things about this book I found was the very ending. This is not a traditional ending, I would say, because despite certain moments being super satisfying, an emotion that I took away from a lot of these final chapters was not something I was expecting, and that was fear. And the fact that he managed to pull that off, with the ending still being super coherent and meaningful, I cannot get over how fantastic it was. I literally read half of this book in a single day. There have not been very many times I've read that much in the day before. I don't know if I could have spent it with a better book. I was probably going to wait a while before continuing on with Joe Abercrombie's other books. I don't think it's going to be all that much longer anymore. Like, I was expecting this to be great, but it completely blew me out of the water. Like, as far as my favorite books go, this is up there with A Storm of Swords or The Lord of the Rings. Like, I would highly recommend this to anyone who has an interest in dark fantasy at all. I know a bunch of you guys came over from the manga stuff and don't actually read books, they just watch the videos. I don't care. Read it, please. Holy Jesus. And you know the part that makes me the most excited? I consistently hear that these books are even better. Anyway, I want to talk about spoilers for a little bit, so if you have not read the First Law trilogy, at least the first one, please leave. Holy God, please, you don't want to be here. The whole sequence where Jezal becomes king was it for me. It took me out. I couldn't even fathom what was happening. It was an expertly built up twist. It made me see Bayaz in a completely different light, and I loved every second of what happened there. I loved his rise to the throne, how just utterly confused he was, how the council initially dismissed him because they thought he was an idiot without realizing what the events that had happened during before they are hanged sort of turned him into a competent leader. I love how he appoints West to be the leader of the army. Seeing him rise to the top above the other commanders were so satisfying. I didn't mention West in the last video, but he is such an interesting character, because like after The Blade itself, I really didn't like him, obviously because of what he did to his sister RD, but he sort of redeemed himself in my eyes when, of course, he killed the prince. It was a secret, no one knows he did it, and he even notes this, that it's very wild to think that the reason Jezal became king was because he killed one of the heirs, and because he did that, now he is the leader of the army. The Bloody Nine himself, Logan Ninefingers, also becomes a king, defeating Bethed's champion, the Feared, in single combat, and oh my God, this sequence was probably my favorite in the entire series. I loved how he played with the point of views of Logan and Dogman, sort of switching between them as Dogman was like going to kill the witch. Excellent, incredible stuff. Of course, then the Gurkish invade the capital. And things are not looking too good. Like, there's this just crazy sense of dread in this whole sequence because of how bad things look. Jezal had just become king, and now he fears he is going to be the last king of the Union. But of course, Bayaz had his plan the entire time. The magical artifact they were looking for in the last book but couldn't find, it ends up being in the Tower of the Maker the whole time, and he uses it to literally unleash hell by breaking the first law. And while the day is saved, is it really? As most of the city is destroyed, and it also created this, like, crazy plague that starts killing people in droves. Like, the last chapters were a real roller coaster of emotions. The fact that West got infected and seemingly dies at the end, that hurt, man. That hurt. Especially he reconciled with his sister, and with Jezal, it was like, oh, man, why'd you gotta, oh. And of course, like, Bayaz is basically the villain of the series, which I definitely did not expect, of course. I mean, he was basically the Gandalf archetype. And while he did do things that benefited people, like, of course, he stopped the war here, it all seemed to be for very selfish reasons. And then at the ending, he very menacingly just goes up to Jezal and he's like, oh, listen, I know you're king, but come on, man. You're my bitch. And he leaves the city with an absolute chokehold over Jezal and Glokta. Glokta, of course, who does become the Archlector. His ending was honestly probably the best out of all of these characters, which is funny because he's probably the worst person who we follow. The last minute twist that Ruse, the guy who he tortured in the very first, chapter of the first book, had returned under a different identity and had been following him, waiting for a chance to get his revenge. My God. Could not, but at that point in the book, I still could not believe we were doing the crazy reveals. But then he joins Glokta, and then they go off to torture the old Archlector, who was the reason for a lot of their troubles in the first place. And I love that scene. It was very dark and messed up, but very satisfying. Then, of course, we had Logan's ending, where he returns to the North on his throne, but he was betrayed by Black Dow, and he casts himself off a cliff into the ocean. That is how the book ends, and we do not know what happens to Logan. I'm inclined to believe that he survived just because this is sort of how the first book started, kind of like a parallel. I don't know what the rest of the books in this series entail or if he will be in them, so yeah, very bittersweet ending for most of the characters, but I do think it really did fit the tone of this, grim, dark world. So yeah, those were my thoughts. That's what I had to say. If you want to discuss any spoilers down below, make sure you have it set so you can read more to see them. And yeah, with that, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all soon for a new video.